Hi, I'm Rich Hilsinger, director of the WoodenBoat School here in Brooklyn, Maine. I recently had the opportunity to stop and visit with Thom McLaughlin at his beautiful studio and shop, just a few miles from our campus. Thom is a prominent boat builder, designer, instructor, author, and accomplished sailor who specializes in wooden pond yachts. We filmed the conversation, and I'd like to share it with you. I hope you find it enjoyable and enlightening. Thanks. And today we're going to explore the world of pond yachts, which is Thom's specialty. So Thom, I'm wondering if you can give our viewers just a little, a brief history of yourself and how you got started in the world of pond yachts.
So I spent my first 30 years in educational institutions, and the second 30 years on the opposite stick as a university art professor in an institution, and then the last 15 years here in this studio, building, designing, working. I've always been fascinated by things that when they're static, they fall over. When they're moving, they're in balance. That's bicycles, motorcycles, and boats. And there's a certain beauty to that, and awe, things that go on outside in the world, in nature, that are humbling. And that's partially the biggest reason underneath all this stuff why I make boats. So the boats that I design, build, sail, they have probably initial beginnings in the 1880s as culture begins to move from an agrarian society to the Industrial Revolution and becoming an urban society with hordes of people crammed into cities. And most of those cities had parks. Ironically, most of them also were Olmsted design parks and ponds. And so small boats began showing up, sailing in those ponds as sort of a recreational activity. Probably mostly model boats, not the racing boats that would occur later, but it was a casual activity. I personally like to think that this former agrarian society needed a connection with nature, and these boats provided that in some ways. Whenever you put several things together, moving, racing begins to occur in people's minds. So it didn't take very long till boats evolved away from models, that models were still going on, but boats that were more extreme, and you can't scale the wind down as you scale a model. So modifications were made to the hulls and the sail designs to allow those boats to perform more effectively, more efficiently. And for me, they're more beautiful in their grace with which they move. So in places like Central Park became an early center for this kind of activity. Golden Gate Park, Spreckles Lake in San Francisco, both of these places are still active places where these objects are sailed. In the 1930s, or prior to the 1930s, the types of racing boats, they followed the international rule for full-size boats, very complicated calculations, and sort of off-putting to a larger body of people to actually make these. There was, in Marblehead, Massachusetts, another one of the centers for these boats. An individual suggested a rule where the boat was only 50 inches long and 800 square inches of sail. And supposedly L. Francis Herreshoff actually had some suggestions or some assistance in that rule being developed, and boom, all of a sudden it was a very simple boat. It was transportable in a car at 50 inches, and it became a designer's class. And it's the boats that fascinate me, that I design to still, but the number of boats just increased dramatically with this Marblehead class, becoming an international class by the mid-1930s. Even the Olympics in 1936, the Marbleheads were part of the competitive sailing class. And that activity kept occurring after World War II. World War II and suburban developments and people leaving cities, this activity kind of began to diminish and almost disappeared until the 1970s, when radio control became more available, more possible, and these boats, there was a resurgence of that activity, which still goes on today. Very technical boats, carbon fiber boats, and the boats that really interest me and a lot of other people are still the wooden hold boats.
So Thom, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit what drew you initially into the world of pond yachts?
So most of the art that I was making before pond boats was sculpture and paintings that referenced these moments in nature where things were in a temporary balance and we were humbled and we were in awe. Some of that's reflected in the landscape paintings of Thomas Cole and Frederick Church from the 19th century. And then also there's those parks that Frederick Olmsted was designing during that period. There was a point where I just didn't want to be a part of the gallery museum world anymore, and I wanted to be in a more public situation and a larger audience. And how by flukes and chance, boats began to appear they'd been appearing in images that I was making before, but the actual building of them and sailing them in public parks, that became the art that I was making. Sailing these boats, it's when you're on a full-size boat, there's sounds, smells, just wonderful experiences, but it's you and a few other people on that boat. Sailing these boats in public parks, it's a lot of people and watching other people sailing, participating, and you're viewing that in a sort of frame of reference, very much like a painting. And it's a way of sort of capturing these objects and their awe and their beauty. And that's what led me to making these. Also, I've always been envious of musicians, especially stringed instruments and wind instrument musicians that can put this object that they produce this art with in a case, and they go places and they perform, and it's less cumbersome than large sculpture and whatnot. So in a lot of ways now, I consider myself a luthier, a maker of instruments. I don't perform other than sail.
When it comes to choosing a construction method, the pond yacht builder will be faced with the same decisions that anyone building a larger traditional wooden boat has to make. Here's Thom describing the various techniques in wooden pond yacht construction.
We were talking earlier about how these boats evolved, and I mentioned the Marblehead class of boats, and all three of these boats in progress on the Strongbacks are Marblehead class boats. They were very simple rule, invited people to create out of their own mind, and there was a lot of people building these boats of not naval architecture background, not even boating background. It was something that was done. Building was started on a kitchen table in the wintertime, and as the winter proceeded, the boat was put together, painted, and sails were built. And in the spring, the boat was launched and it was raced throughout the summer and into the fall, and then the cycle often happened again. What's fascinating to me that a lot of this activity was by ordinary people, not necessarily yacht clubs, but a local activity. A lot of the initial building early on, people looked at full-size boats and the construction methods that occurred there with strong backs that the holes were built on, keelsons that were rabbeted, so planks would run into that rabbet, floors, ribs over frames, really full-size boat construction methods that likely weren't needed for boats this small. But we also currently live with adhesives that weren't available during that period. So maybe that strong, heavy building that those boats were built with was necessary. Stuff that I've done over the years, the last 25 years, is evolve those techniques. When we first started building boats in Marblehead Boats in the course at WoodenBoat in the late 90s, we were using some of those traditional techniques. The first couple years, the boats did have floors, they did have ribs, although the ribs were 1/16 inch plywood bent over a mold. But the more I did this, the more I realized that you don't need all that heavy structure. So what's sitting here are three different tactics that I'm currently working with. And this boat, this is actually by design. It's not a UFA Fox International 14, but that's where the design for this started. So it's very flat in the back and very sharp in the front. There's contemporary boats that, especially Outlier, that came out of the Brooklyn Boatyard that have this also kind of appearance to it. But anyway, this is set up. It's ready for planking. The keelson's been planed so it fits the shape of the mold. Planks would be laid over these molds and fastened to the keelson or the stem or the transom. The planking was fastened to the molds initially with brass screws or toothpick tips, and that's initially at WoodenBoat we were doing the toothpick tips. But all that was really needed for was to hold the planks that were being edge glued till the glue set, and it becomes a really strong structure. And as other people began taking those frames and floors and stuff out of these pond boats, all of a sudden boats that typically might have been 2.5, 3 pounds in construction became 2 pounds, and that means you can put that extra design weight into the ballast, and the boat's going to perform better that way. So this is set up for a plank roll. What's sitting over here is a real kind of complex oddity that's just an elegant shape. This is set up to be cold molding. Cold molding of these pond boats goes back to the 1900s. If you look in the old books about these boats, you can actually see diagrams and suggestions of cold molding with cardstock and varnishing that cardstock. And workable boats. I don't think they were doing that to save weight. I think it was just another construction method. But this is where I've gotten to with cold molding and the experiments that I've been doing, where there's an armature of stringers that are built up and some ribs, so where the diagonal cold molding is laid on here. This is a really stiff, it's bending, a really stiff structure. And in the process, the cold molding material that I've been using is Spanish cedar, but it's only about 1/32 plus thick, so it gets to be a really thin hull, and then it's sealed with epoxy, and it's really a strong, light surface. So There's another half a pound that can be saved in this process, going into the ballast. And then over here is molds that have been set up for a chine hole. And chine holes would have typically had chine logs and stringers or inwells across the top to support those panels. What I've been doing with chine holes is actually making the panels and fastening them down to the molds and beveling the edges where the panels meet and gluing that. And it's become a very strong, secure monocoque structure. All of these are monocoque structures by the time they're off the molds. And then using a glass or epoxy fillet on the inside. Very, very much like, I've learned a lot from Nick Schad and Bill Thomas and at WoodenBoat as far as strip plank canoe building and chine building that I've scaled down to work. All three of these holes that I'm working on a book about all this stuff. I'm smiling because it's just a tedious task. But these are basically the final test versions of what will be covered in that book. These were designed last winter, the strongback set up, and they'll be finished in the fall over the winter and heavily documented. But there's other versions of chine boats and plank boats and cold mold boats. This is a Marblehead hull that's been cold molded, and you can see the diagonals inside. On the first layer, there's a second layer. The diagonals are going a different way, and it's got some flex to it. But by the time the deck is on there, it'll be a really strong hull. But it does save weight. It's really tedious. It probably is like 3 times the time spent in building a planked hull. I want to say one other thing about chine hulls too. Chine hulls, people think that they're easy to build, and maybe, yeah, there's 4 panels there, and that's less than 30 some planks here, but still, building boats, it's like building a house. It's easy to put up the stick structure, seal it in, but the devil's in the detail. So there's probably 300 to 400 hours in finishing these boats, and we're back to, it's like building a small boat again, and they're not really models. Models can be really time-consuming also, but there's a difference where this, to me, is functional sculpture when they're being sailed. And it's kind of like we're sitting here in my shop, in my studio, looking at hulls, when really these things to me aren't alive till they're out in the environment sailing. So I think a lot of the time that I spend in the studio and designing is trying to decipher how things perform and differences between. So there's 4 boats sitting here right now that all come from the same design, the same molds, but varied a little bit. When I was designing this boat, the design's called Sylvan, it was initially inspired by Yankee 1 designs that Starling Burgess designed. But by the time one takes that initial inspiration and meddles with the sections to create a certain displacement and load water line that one is wanting, it's no longer that boat. But all 4 of these are things that were inspired by Starling Burgess's Yankee 1 design. They all have, and maybe I'll pick them up as we go by here, different ballast shapes to them. This is a ballast that was called a seal flipper ballast that was developed on the West Coast in the the mid 40s and the 1950s. And it's also very narrow compared to other ballasts. It's higher, which consequently means it can affect how the boat performs, balances. But this boat also comes from the same molds. This is 8.5 inches wide. This is 8 inches wide. It's got the same length of waterline of 46 and I think a half inches, something like that. But it has a different keel shape. And this ballast shape actually stems from a shield keel, which I think were in the 50s when those were developed. But it's a way of forcing the ballast down lower, but consequently wider than this boat. This boat obviously is not finished. This boat I raced all last year. It did very well, especially when I stayed focused. There's a big trophy up there in the rafters of the studio that in the fall there's a Bethel Cup in Marblehead that this boat won. But it's the cold molded version of this also. So it only displaces 13 3/4 pounds and 8.5 pounds of ballast. So it performs really well, especially if the person sailing it stays focused. This is another version, very similar to the boat that I had initially, but a typical teardrop ballast, lower body of material. This one's interesting, I think, because it's got a cedar deck, and this is actually clapboard siding. And it's a very traditional method of making a deck, especially in New England, where there's a lot of clapboard buildings. This boat it's planked hull, not cold molded, and then this other one is a chine hull, and it's a chine version of this Sullivan design, and it's a seal flipper type ballast, but a much deeper, which means the rig on this can be much taller, all the way up to the maximum of an 80-inch main luff. And this boat also is very light, like this one. It's also 13 3/4 pound.
I know Thom enjoys the design process as much as he likes building these beautiful boats. L. Francis Harrishoff, Joel White, Paul Gartside, and other designers provide Thom with much of the inspiration that goes into his work.
But this is usually a couple months of the year, November, December, as the season change, as I wind up in here. And I just find this whole process of creating three-dimensional form from two-dimensional surfaces just a really fascinating challenge. And it also is the same process for these boats as naval architects use in designing their boats. I don't have to worry about, like a whole bunch of furniture and stuff inside the boat and etc. But the same formulas for displacement and center of buoyancy and balance are the ones that naval architects use. And a lot of this kind of work is done in the computer in CAD presently. I've done that. It's something I feel that you have to do every day or you're constantly relearning. But I especially like the fact of drawing on vellum and taking a pencil lead and leaving a mark, leaving a line. So there's instruments, drafting ducks, battens. Those ducks will hold down into a curve. This batten happens to be thinner at this end and thicker here, so it will bend differently. There's a whole box of ship's curves that are very different than French curves that are here. And those are some of the tools that I use when I'm designing. There's also things called planimeters. This one happens to be from Switzerland, and very sort of right-angled rigid, very Germanic. These are taken and follow a form, and they register a number. Basically, I think they perform calculus, and they measure the square area of an irregular section. And those numbers at each section are put into those formulas, Simpson's rule or the trapezoidal rule, and that calculates the displacement of the boat. And if it's not where you want it, you start making adjustments in the curvature or the section shape, and it's all just a really challenging body of parts that have to come together into a sculptural object. So this one's, I love this. This one's Germanic, this one's Austrian, and this one's Italian. So it's a bunch of curves and round shapes and that sexy Italian aesthetic. There's things that I look at. Down here, had talked about that Sylvan design, which, no, this one's not. The Sylvan design coming from Starling Burgess, that's where they start, or that boat started. L. Francis Herreshoff is someone that I highly respect, look at just for his sense of proportions and shape, his experimentation, perhaps much more so than his father. He's just a fascinating full-size designer. And there's another designer that I think about a lot, a man named J. Selmar Larson, who most people would not have heard of. He lived in Marblehead at the same time that Starling Burgess and L. Francis did. He was an ornamental sculptor for the Olmsted firm, but he also designed and sailed these pond boats in Marblehead. And there was something about his shapes that are really appealing to me, that are different from other boats. The way that the sheer has a slight rise and fall to it, the proportions, and he figures into, well, it's not in here, a boat called Halcyon that I designed. That's very much his thoughts. So I'm looking at full-size designers, those three in particular. I'm using techniques that most naval architects no longer use, and it's just a really fulfilling process for me to go from these two-dimensional views into this three-dimensional form.
I asked Thom to recount his personal experience of teaching at Wooden Boat School for 21 years.
So I mentioned that I also had spent 30 years at the other side of the educational institutions as a university professor. But I also spent 21 years teaching at Wooden Boat. And that was some of the most wonderful educational experiences for me. When I was a university art professor, I primarily worked with graduate students one-on-one in their studio. Wooden Boat, intense, wonderful, week, highly productive, people from all walks of life, full of curiosity, wanting to be there. Intense week like a seminar at a university, but really fulfilling. And the amount of work that got done in those classes in that week takes me a month in the studio. When I started at Wooden Boat, that was before the internet. The phone service, Rich used to tell stories about having to walk up by the yellow sign on the hill, maybe to get phone service. And that evolved over time. But the people continued, whether it be the staff, the students, and there were friendships that were also formed during that time. And people, I can name a number of people that became repeat people in the class, that build a number of boats, put a lot of these boats out into the world that I couldn't have done on my own. And I really appreciate what Wooden Boat and all those other individuals have done, getting these boats out in the public spaces and sailing and letting other people see their elegance, their beauty, their simplicity. And that couldn't have happened without WoodenBoat. There was also something that happened in the mid-90s, shortly before I began teaching at WoodenBoat, and that was the forming of something that's now called the U.S. Vintage Model Yacht Group. And that started in Marblehead, Massachusetts, with a number of individuals that grew up sailing these boats, and another individual from the West Coast, Earl Bober, who as a kid in Berkeley used to ride his bicycle down to the bay where there was one of the WPA ponds that were built for sailing these boats. Earl went on to become a nuclear scientist working out of Los Alamos, but probably in his 50s or 60s, in the 1990s, mid-1990s, he and some other people in Marblehead, Massachusetts, formed this vintage model yacht group. And I was also one of those early members of that group in the formative stage. It still exists. It's a wonderful body of material for people that are interested in these boats. But again, WoodenBoat, probably, I would suspect, a third or maybe even a half of the vintage Marbleheads that are registered with that group came out of WoodenBoat. So WoodenBoat has been a great vehicle for more people to see and enjoy these boats. In the art world, Andy Warhol supposedly created a clone of himself to go out and do lectures and et cetera, et cetera. And in some ways I've always looked at WoodenBoat as being a way of sending a lot of people out as clones of that experience. So in terms of workspaces in the studio, it's just incredible that I have this space. And this can be done in a basement, in a garage, on a kitchen table. But this particular area is where I usually put rigs together, sails, the masts, the booms. So what's here right now is a rig that's in process, an aluminum mast, and some aluminum booms. What's on here in blue is the sails that this particular rig will carry. It's a really tall rig. It's at the limits of what a Marblehead rig can legally be. In other words, it's got a 78-inch main luff, and the limit is 80 inches. Air on a pond, air period. It's up there, not right down on the water. So taller rigs can keep that engine, keep that motion moving. But then we're back to that thing about ballast and how deep the draft is and how much ballast is down there. This rig will be really good in light air. As the wind increases, I'll probably have to go down to a shorter rig, which is what's sitting next to here. When I go sailing, I usually probably take 2, maybe sometimes 3 rigs along to change as air might increase. The vintage Marblehead rules require the sails to be made out of a woven material. Originally they were Egyptian cotton. That's really hard to find now. It also is not as stable as Dacron, which these are, and this fits the vintage rules. What they can't be is contemporary materials like Mylar. There's other classes of boats, radio-controlled sailboats, that use those materials. But this is a Marblehead rig, all folded up for travel, and another one that's in process here. Aluminum masts are legal. They were used throughout the history of these boats. Wood might have been more typical. The wooden masts that we were making in the course at WoodenBoat are actually laminated out of 4 1/8 inch strips of material and then shaped from there. I don't know whether it's in the camera or not. There's underneath this table is basically a big vise to laminate those long 80-inch long pieces of pine to construct the mast. The booms can also be made out of wood. There's actually two booms stock taped together here. These happen to be bent over a mold and laminated. That's fairly exotic instead of a straight boom. This potentially keeps the boom out of the water when the boat is heeled on a reach, and keeps the boom from dragging in the water. So there's also sitting on the table is a radio control unit. The vintage boats can only use two channels, one to control the sails. It would act as a sail winch, and another one to control the rudder. This shaft goes back and attaches to the top of the rudder and moves it back and forth as the servo moves. This is not a drum winch. There are people that advocate drum winches, and this is an arm winch, so this would go to the main and this would go to the jib. For me, this is a much simpler, it's also typically a faster setup. There's less pulleys and cheats and stuff. It's just simpler, and it's the typical of what we have done at the course. It's not that I don't like drum winches. I've got a whole bunch of new boats that are going to use drum winches, but this is just a real simple setup. Before radio control, these boats were sailed with devices that are really similar to contemporary vane steering devices on full-size sailboats. They were raced. The vane, the steering control was set up to run windward on a leg on a pond 1,000 feet or more in length and maybe 500 feet wide, and when it would get to the other end, that would be readjusted and it would go downwind or do broad reaches. Quite often there was two people that were sailing, one on one side of the pond and another one on the other side of the pond to catch the boat as it tacked or went down the pond. That racing was usually match racing, or the tallies of match races were kept numerical recordings of, to record who may have done the best out of that particular race. Free sailing is fascinating because it's these strange objects that are meant to mechanically respond to gentle forces of the wind on the main and slightly adjust the rudder. So basically it was a trim tab to keep the boat on course. In San Francisco, they still sail actively free sailing boats there. I find the radio control sailing more interesting, more responsive, more a part of the boat. And the racing that's done with these boats is just like full-size racing boats. Around buoys, start lines, probably a lot of times 10, 15 boats coming down on the start line that's 50 to 75 feet wide. It can get congested. And they go to marks, round marks, 4 boat length round marks instead of 2 that full-size boats use. It follows the same rules. But a lot of what I'm doing with my vintage designs is orienting towards racing around buoys, not free sailing boats. So this idea of being able to turn, pick up speed because of weight or lightweight and balance. Free sail vintage Marbleheads were typically 16 to 22 pounds. Radio controlled vintage Marbleheads are anywhere from 13 and a half, 13 3/4 up to 16, or if it's truly a vintage Marblehead, it can go all the way up to 22 pounds. 22 pounds, that's a lot of like energy moving, so when the wind goes light, that boat's going to generate its own wind, and it's going to move and maybe do actually better than a light boat. There's no perfect boat, there's only capable boats.
Well, thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. It's always a pleasure when I have the opportunity to get together with Thom, and again, I hope that you've had an educational, enjoyable glimpse into the world of pond yachts. Thom, thanks so much for putting the welcome mat out for us to come in today and have a listen into a part of your life that is important to you and so many others. Thanks for all the years that you taught at WoodenBoat School and for carrying on the tradition of wooden boats.
Thank you. It's always been a pleasure to be involved. Thank you.